All right, everyone, welcome, welcome. What we are working on right now is we are starting our period 5. This is the period 1844 to lead us through 1877, end of Reconstruction. We are going to call this time period expansion, crisis, and rebuilding. So again, I have some timelines. This one actually goes for 2 slides because there is a lot that happens during this time period. You can see it goes through some of the events that we've actually already discussed. I did talk about Seneca Falls already, talked a little bit about Texas becoming its own country. It will come in as a state. We have things that are political parties that are forming, important decisions that happen, events that lead us obviously to the Civil War, events throughout the Civil War that happen, and then obviously leading us through things that happen in Reconstruction. So these are all very important dates. Please make sure you take a look at them, make sure you're aware of what those things are. Obviously, those civil rights amendments, make sure you're very clear on the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. All right, so let's take a look during this time. Again, this is quite a bit of cover. This is going to be a longer unit. So we're going to first look at our U.S. foreign policy. So there is quite a bit of interest in the United States at this time in expanding our trade. Clipper ships are something that allow us for faster travel and boost our trade with Asia. So what we have at this time is we have something that is the Treaty of 1844 that goes through, and it is the very first diplomatic agreement between the United States and China. And it is the Treaty of Guangxi. So that's a very important thing. It also is a huge goal of the United States to make sure that we promote trade. So as a result of that, many missionaries are going throughout China, trying to spread, for instance, not only trade, but we are also trying to spread Christianity. So almost like when we looked at that gold, God, and glory of people coming to the New World, this is almost in many ways something that is being changed to now look at how we are treating countries in other places of the world as we're doing the exact same thing. Japan is also seen as a place that we would like that trade and an economic relationship with. Japan has been isolated from the world for about 200 years, but President Fillmore sends Commodore Matthew Perry there. And in 1852, trade is open between Japan and the United States. The ships show up and we basically say, you're going to trade or we're going to blow you off the face of the map. So they decide after he returns a year, we give them a year to think about it. They decide they're going to open up and that they are going to trade. When we look, the United States is becoming more connected with the world. They are beginning to pursue an expansionist foreign policy in the Western Hemisphere, and they are emerging as a destination for many migrants from other countries. This is where we see things like Manifest Destiny, the Mexican-American War, migration, and nativism all take place. So specifically when we look at immigration, Irish immigrants are being driven from Ireland due to the potato crop famine. And this creates a severe famine that goes throughout the 1840s, and they begin to largely settle in places like Boston, in New York, in neighborhoods that begin being described as slums. They go to places like the Five Points District in New York, and they are competing with African Americans, freed African Americans that live there for unskilled labor jobs. Now, this will lead to a lot of racial tension in northern cities. But politically, their vote becomes very important as they support the Democratic Party and they support party bosses like ones such as Tammany Hall, Boss Tweed in New York City in the 1870s and the 1880s. Another large group that will come at this time are the German immigrants, but they are extremely diverse. Remember, Germany is not yet a nation. And they are also very diverse in their religious ideology. There are some that even celebrate, for instance, Judaism as they come. They also form a wide variety of social classes and occupations, and they do not settle in the cities, but instead they are more likely to go to the old Northwest and to the frontier, and they are going to form a very tightened German community. Here you can see I have a composite of immigration from 1840 to 1860, just to kind of give you an idea. These are the 3 top groups that are coming, and you could see English population as it's coming, the German population it's coming, and the Irish population as it's coming. Now, we've seen this before, but this is the idea of nativism. And when we see, these nativists come through, what is happening with this? Why are they coming? And why would they even be here? And they are coming for various reasons. So they are coming because for many of them, they are facing all sorts of issues that are happening in their home countries. There are different factors that are pushing them out of Germany, pushing them out of England, pushing them out of Ireland. But why did nativism rise in our country? Well, there's a lot of reasons why that happens also. So many felt that they were taking our jobs, and that was felt especially harshly against the Irish. Also, they're working for really low wages. So many are concerned that, because of that, they are going to be hired because people can pay them less. There's also the concern that they're going to outvote those that they consider quote unquote Native Americans. We're not talking about the Native Americans. We're talking about people who already live in the United States that are white. And they are worried that they're going to ruin what they consider the Anglo culture because they are seen as inferior. Now, remember, they are white. The only thing that differentiates them is that they are Catholic. And that is a huge concern that they are going to ruin what they consider a Protestant white Anglo-Saxon America. So to fight against groups like this, we have things rise. One of those things is the Order of the Star Spangled Banner, also known as the Know Nothing Party. And these are a group of American activists, nativists that are going to advocate for restrictions against the immigration happening in the United States at this time. But remember, America is still becoming more ethnically and racially diverse through this period. Now, that leads us to a period that we call manifest destiny. So, there is a huge enthusiasm for territorial expansion in the United States, and it is based on economic issues, it is based on national security issues, and it is based on the claims of US racial and cultural superiority. And this leads us to the belief of manifest destiny, the idea that it is America's destiny to conquer and civilize the entire continent from the East Coast to the West Coast. This idea is created in 1845 by John O'Sullivan, a newspaper editor, and he believes it is our God-given right to do this. And we are going to see this idea emerge again when we talk about imperialism. And it is going to be a idea that it's going to give us access to lots of resources. Now, this idea is built heavily upon the belief of white superiority and that we are going to be the people that are going to civilize society. All right, at this exact same time when Manifest Destiny is happening, there is Texas that's going on. There are 3 times as many whites in Texas as there are Mexicans in Texas. Please remember that up until the time up until the time Texas becomes its own nation, which it was its own nation for a short period of time, it is actually Mexican land. It is part of Mexico. So the whites that live there, they're Southern, they're Protestant, they're slave owning, or at the very least, they are sympathetic to the idea of slavery. And the Texans had revolted against the rules that were set up by the Mexicans for them to come there. And what were the rules? They told them that they had to become Mexican citizens, that they had to become Catholic, and that they could not bring slaves. They didn't do any of those things. So Sam Houston declares them independent. Mexico obviously does not like that idea because it is Mexico. So they send forces north to put down what they see as a rebellion, and they win a stunning victory at the Alamo, where everyone is wiped out. So in retaliation for that, Houston and his army engages the Mexicans in the Battle of San Jacinto, and this ends up where they capture the Mexican general and they sign the treaty granting Texas independence. Now, Mexico did not recognize that. They said that General Santa Anna did not have the ability to sign such a treaty or to put forth such a treaty. They did not recognize the independence of Texas at all. And so when Texas applied for statehood to the United States, this was a problem because the United States did not want to go to war with Mexico. So both Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren are not going to admit Texas because they are afraid it will cause that war. John Tyler does work to admit Texas, but ultimately annexation is denied by the United States Senate because no one believed that that was something that was actually good for the United States or that would benefit the country. But this becomes an election issue. It becomes an election issue in 1844. And there are threats over not just Texas, but also Oregon. And the Oregon, we see this fight emerge with the 54-40 fight. No fighting happened. Polk ran on the idea that he would annex Oregon, California, and Texas. And when he was elected, he saw this as a mandate from the people to bring these territories into the Union. So in 1946, a treaty is signed by President Polk. He is a huge believer in manifest destiny, and that allows the occupation of the United States of Oregon at the 49th parallel. In the very waning months of Tyler's presidency, he gets a treaty signed to annex Texas before Polk takes office. And this annexation of Texas is going to end up doing exactly what we were afraid it was going to. It is going to create a war with Mexico. And that leads us to the Mexican-American War. So Polk takes office and he then sends John Slidell to Mexico City to negotiate. He wants California and he wants New Mexico. And they clearly say, we're not going to have that happen, okay? He also wants to try to settle what is considered the southern border between Mexico and the United States. They say the southern border is the Nueces River. The United States says the southern border is the Rio Grande. So Polk decides to send General Zachary Taylor to occupy the territory in between the two. He's dancing around. He's trying to create a war. Takes a long time, but Mexico finally attacks. And Polk asks for war, and it's immediately granted, of which the United States wins. This all ends in 1848 with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, where Mexico loses a huge section of their territory to the United States. We call this the Mexican Secession of 1848. Under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, Hispanic residents of the area are guaranteed their property and citizenship rights. Often they are not actually upheld, though. They often lose them by court actions or forced sale. And any Native American that lived there got absolutely no respect at all. We also have somebody called David Wilmot, and he added an amendment to an appropriations bill going through Congress. We call it the Wilmot Proviso, and it proposed that any land gained from the victory in the Mexican-American War should be off limits to slavery. Now understand, this territory is south of the 3630, which has very clearly been stated in the Missouri Compromise would be open to slavery. This is ultimately voted down, but it shows the growing tension over slavery between the North and the South. Now, the politicians who voted it down are not abolitionists by any means, but many of them believe in the idea of something emerging called free soil. And the free soilers often believe the idea that when people are there, there should not be slavery in the territories, but it's not necessarily always because they are abolitionists, but instead some of them are racist and they don't want to live amongst Black people. So that's important to remember. Also, there are people who want land out west. So we're going to see this fight go back and forth between the two groups. It's going to eventually lead to, obviously, bleeding Kansas. We do see Western migration happening during this time. Expansion is taking place over time from the 1850s on. We see this really beginning in 1847 when the Mormons go west seeking religious refuge for their faith. In 1848, there is the California Gold Rush that brings thousands to the Bay Area. Large groups are there by 49. That's why we call them the 49ers. So that is very important. There are many calls at this point to enter California into the Union because so many people live there, and obviously it wants to come in as a free state, which is going to cause tension because California is so long and wide. Part of it lies under the 3630, part of it lies above the 3630. How are we going to do this? There are many new economic opportunities, and there's ideas of religious refuge for people out west, and these are key factors for bringing people out west, including freed African Americans and Asians and people from all over the world, frankly. Another new and big idea during this time is that the federal government is actively promoting the economic development and the movement of people west during this time period. Economic activities out west are largely driven by federal government policies. One of the great examples of that is the Pacific Railroad Act of 1864. Okay. And what this does is it authorizes the building of the Transcontinental Railroad along the northern route. Now, this happens during the Civil War. The federal government provides money and land and also provides subsidies to the railroads to construct these railroads. And this will play an important role in linking California to the rest of the Union, thereby creating a national market. There are also numerous mining booms that happen during this time out west. So we have the California Gold Rush, and this causes the population, like I said before, of the California Bay Area to grow. We have the Comstock lode that happens, which does the exact same thing in Nevada. This leads to the growth of Virginia City. This happens in Idaho. This happens in Colorado. And it brings people not only from the eastern part of the United States out west, but also people from places like China and other nations. There's also a large movement of people to the Trans-Mississippi West to start farms. And a big part of this is due to the Homestead Act of 1862. And this offers free public land, 160 acres per person, as long as you can stay there for 5 years. And that makes it something, that's extraordinarily important because it's going to help really create many people that go west for this region. So what is the impact of this Western expansion? Okay, what is the impact? The biggest example that we are going to see is the extraordinarily environmental changes that are going to take place during this westward expansion. So as territories are brought into the Union, we know that there's going to be fights about slavery, and it's going to become center stage for sectionalism. We're going to talk about that a little bit more when we talk about some of those specific events. It's important to know that obviously, this western expansion, though, this is one of those impacts, but there's other impacts besides the fact that there is sectionalism during this time. One of the most noticeable is the severe decline in the population of the buffalo. Many are killed to make way for railroads. Others are killed because they want to undermine Native American society. It hurts their ability to resist white expansion during this time. There is also a huge demand for buffalo hide in the eastern markets. Another environmental change we're going to see is the removal of grasslands. And this is going to end up leading to huge problems when we talk about the Dust Bowl out east, out west during the Great Depression, when we look at how come farmers face such a problem starting in the 1920s. And it's because the root systems were pulled up and it allowed that topsoil to blow away. And that soil erosion really degraded the land. The biggest impact, though, is going to take place, obviously, on the lives of Native Americans in the Trans-Mississippi West. This is going to lead to brutal conflict between the American settlers and the Native people. A couple examples of these things that happened. Number one is the Sand Creek Massacre of 1864, where a Colorado militia attacks and kills over 100 Native American people, about 2/3 of which were just women and children. Another famous example is the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876, when members of the Sioux tribe, inspired by Sitting Bull, killed General Custer and his men, the 7th Cavalry. We call this Custer's Last Stand. So those are just two great examples of battles that wage out west. Native Americans at this time, though, are very much expected to assimilate to white society, and they're often forced onto reservations at this time. So that is something that, has to be talked about, and it's going to be a policy of the United States often to decide what's happening with the Native Americans, and this is going to continue as a problem through President Johnson in the 1960s. So this is not a problem that is solved quickly by any means. Now, there is various conflict that happens and that is caused by this expansion. So when we look, there is these expansions are intensified, and they are intensified by not only the expansion, but also the deepening regional divisions at this time. And there's numerous debates over slavery, economic issues, cultural issues, political issues that lead this nation to a civil war. And some of the big ideas that are going to happen during this are things like the Compromise of 1850, fighting over slavery, the failure of compromises, 1860, and the succession. So In the 1950s, there are numerous challenges to territorial expansion, and they are becoming more and more common. For instance, a group of Southerners created something called the Ostend Manifesto. And this is a secret plan by the Southerners to buy Cuba and get it from Spain and turn it into a slave state. Now, this is opposed by free soilers in Congress and many Northerners, and President Pierce had to finally back down from the idea because it came out before it actually happened. We also see the Gadsden Purchase happen when land was purchased in the Southwest from Mexico in 1853 for the building of a railroad. And this provokes quite a bit of controversy between the North and the South. Now, you do see here also other conflicts that are caused. We see the Mexican-American War, which I've already discussed, the Wilmot Proviso, which I've already discussed. And now what we're going to talk about is a couple of the compromises that happen, and that's going to detail with us, obviously, the Compromise of 1850. So let's look at specifically a couple of the compromises just to kind of give us an idea that there was attempts to hold this nation together. It's one of the reasons why we didn't go to war in 1820, why we didn't go to war in 1850. So when land was gained during the Mexican-American War and the Mexican secession was there, we had to discuss what to do with it. Now, we already know the Wilmot Proviso was struck down, so what do you do? So first, there is something called the Southern position. They argued that slavery is a constitutional right, okay? That is what they are saying. And that the issue of where slavery can and cannot exist had already been decided. They said it was very clear. It was discussed in the Missouri Compromise, and you can see right there the Missouri Compromise line where it is. And they're arguing that large amounts of the property that was gained during the Mexican secession should fall to slavery. You also have those who argue the free soil movement kind of point of view. These are Northern Democrats and Whigs, and they want any new territories acquired to be in the dominion of free laborers, not enslaved ones. But there are conflicting views as to why. Some believe in abolition, others are racist and do not want Black, slave, or free to settle in the area. And then you have a popular sovereignty point of view that is emerging. This is the idea of people power. And the thought is that the people in each territory should decide for themselves what happens. Now, popular sovereignty would overturn the idea of the Missouri Compromise of 1820, because if you're going to allow the people themselves to decide, there is no more line. It is they deciding and voting for themselves. So attempts at compromise over slavery ultimately failed to reduce any form of tensions. So an example of these compromises is that Compromise of 1850 done yet again by Henry Clay. So compromise said that the Mexican secession would be divided into the Utah Territory and the New Mexico Territory, and that they would practice popular sovereignty in both. Then California would be admitted as a slave state, that the slave trade would be banned in the District of Columbia, but that a much stronger and stricter Fugitive Slave Act would be passed and upheld with vigor in the North. And this Fugitive Slave Act sparked huge controversies in the North because Northerners now had to deal with the issue of slavery. It has its origins in a 1793 act, which established parameters for the legal capture and return of slaves. And this act was strengthened by this Compromise of 1850, and it remained viable until 1864. Now, people in the North resisted the enforcement of these fugitive slave acts with things like personal liberty laws. One of the things that they did not allow happen, for instance, is when they tried to capture runaway slaves and put them in jail, they would not allow them to use their local jails to house these fugitive slaves. And they also used vigilance committees to protect fugitive slaves from the slave catchers. Now, a huge storm erupts when Stephen Douglas introduces something called the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. Under this act, slavery would be decided by popular sovereignty in the territories of both Kansas and Nebraska. And this act would repeal the Missouri Compromise line of 1820 and potentially open up slavery north of the 3630 line. Many people in the North, including Democrats of the North, opposed this idea. It passed in Congress, and because of this, the Republican Party is formed in 1854, and we see the Whig Party disappear from national politics all over the division of whether to support the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The Republican Party specifically has the abolition of slavery in its platform. And the Northerners see this as a way that the South can, frankly, expand slavery in a place that it had not been before. And so they see the Kansas-Nebraska Act as a violation of the rights of things that have been established for quite a while. And it is going to only cause sectionalism to grow in this country. And so throughout the 1850s, these sectional tensions just continue to increase. As a result of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, we see Bleeding Kansas happen. This is where pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces engage in a little mini civil war in Kansas that continues throughout the Civil War. It does not end until the Civil War is over. Thousands of pro-slavery Missourians pour across the border and they vote and create a government in Kansas that is not really from people who live in Kansas. Then we have the sack of Lawrence, where pro-slavery people attack free soilers in Lawrence. We also have the Pottawatomie Creek Massacre, where John Brown hacks to death pro-slavery supporters. And so these two rival governments set up. We have the Topeka and we have the Lecompton. The Topeka are the free soil government and the Lecompton are the pro-slavery government. And so we don't have a true government of Kansas. We don't know which one is legal and correct. Franklin Pierce then goes on to recognize the fraudulent Lecompton government, which causes even more anger. And we see that popular sovereignty, the idea of people being able to vote for slavery or not, is an absolute failure. So the violence of Kansas spreads, and it spreads to Congress when we see the Northern Republican Charles Sumner, who's brutally beaten on the floor by Southerner Preston Brooks, and we call this the caning of Charles Sumner. Another thing that pushes sectionalism is the Dred Scott decision. So in Dred Scott v. Sanford, in 1857, Roger Taney leads the Supreme Court, and they rule that African Americans cannot sue in court because they are not citizens. Therefore, they don't have the right to sue. They also uphold that slaves are property, which means they cannot be taken away from their owners without due process, which they say upholds the Fifth Amendment, and that Congress cannot stop slavery from the territories. And so what they argue is that the Missouri Compromise itself is unconstitutional. And the idea is that means that slavery could really be opened up anywhere in the nation. Its potential is to be anywhere. So John Brown, he hopes to then spark a slave revolt. He leaves Kansas, he heads east, and he goes in 1859 to seize a federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. He's hoping to pass out weapons to slaves and lead a rebellion. Ultimately, he fails. He is killed. He is hung. He sees himself as a martyr for the cause, but the South is outraged. And it is one of the immediate causes of secession because they believe that the North has been supporting John Brown in this raid. Also, Lincoln is running for president, and he does not win a single state in the South, which shows that this is a key turning point in the relationship between the North and South, this election of 1860, because he is a sectional president. He does not earn a single vote from the South. There are numerous tensions that are continuing to happen throughout this time that are not just legal precedent, but are just specific tensions between people and groups and events that are happening. And tensions within the Union continue to grow. There is an emphasis amongst the Southerners on something that's called states' rights, and the idea that they can obviously nullify, where they could void or nullify a federal law they disagreed with. Now, we did see this earlier when we talked about Thomas Jefferson and the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions of 1798, when Jefferson and Madison tried to ignore the Alien and Sedition Acts. We see this in 1828 with the Tariff of Abominations, with South Carolinians attempted to ignore that tariff, and Andrew Jackson was forced to intervene. The Southerners in the 1840s and the 50s are talking about things like states' rights, nullification, and secession. This is what's on their mind in the South. In the North, there's a growing Northern abolitionist movement. So in the 1840s and 50s, abolitionists do remain a minority in the North, but they are growing. Lincoln himself is not an abolitionist. However, the movement is becoming more and more visible and a lot more vocal. So we have William Lloyd Garrison, a picture of him right there on the top left. And he is the founder of the American Anti-Slavery Society in 1833. And he calls for the immediate and uncompensated emancipation of slaves. And he publishes things like his paper, The Liberator. We have Uncle Tom's Cabin, that's written by Harriet Beecher Stowe in 1852. And she has a huge role in increasing the support for abolitionists in the North. We have the Underground Railroad, which is continuing to help slaves escape to the North. And one of the most famous people working on that is obviously Harriet Tubman. But you also have violence that emerges during this time. David Walker's Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World calls for the violent uprising and end to slavery. You have Nat Turner's Rebellion in 1832. This is the only rebellion that does lead to the death of white people in Virginia. And as a result, as we discussed, it leads to a crackdown in the movement of African Americans in the South and very stringent slave codes through the South. We have John Brown's raid that we discussed in Harper's Ferry, which strikes fears into the minds of the Southerners because, again, they see him as being supported by the North and also that he's trying to undermine their way of life. And so we see the end of what is called the second party system. Okay. The Whig Party and the Know Nothing Party, or the Nativist Party, both collapse over the division of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The Whigs become divided to the Cotton Whigs, which are pro-slavery, and the Conscience Whigs, which are anti-slavery. At this time, you get the formation of a new political party that rises. It is called the Republican Party. And the Republican Party is truly a sectional party that only has support in the North and the Midwest. Their entire platform is the opposition to the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the opposition to slavery in the new territories. They're going to grow in numbers in the 1850s due to different events such as Bleeding Kansas, such as the Dred Scott decision. And with the election of 1860, the Republican Party platform is based on no extension of slavery into the territories, which is considered the Free Soil platform. Remember, free soilers are not necessarily abolitionists. So this is not necessarily abolitionism, but it is free soil. They are composed, the Republicans, of a ragtag group of people. They're composed of members of the Know Nothing Party, abolitionists, free soilers, conscious Whigs, and so many more. Here is obviously a map of that 1860 election. You can see Lincoln winning not a single vote at all in the South. So the Northern Democrats are going to be represented by Stephen Douglas, also from the state of Illinois. Those Lincoln-Douglas debates, obviously early on, that happened when Douglas ended up winning the Senate position from Illinois, but it makes Lincoln a household name. They're now going to run against each other for president in 1860. So the Northern Democrats, they want slavery to be answered by the idea of popular sovereignty. That's what their belief is, that it should be answered by the states. The Southern Democrats are represented by John Breckinridge. They want slavery in the new territories protected by federal slave codes and by the government. And they said that once then the states become states, then they should be able to pick by popular sovereignty. We have a small group called the Constitutional Unionists. They are represented by John Bell. And then we have the Republicans that are represented by Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln's historic debates with Douglas showed the extreme differences between these two parties, and Lincoln's election shows that sectionalism is growing in the United States. The election of Lincoln is seen as the election of a hostile Northern candidate. That is what it is viewed by the South. In December of 1860, South Carolina withdraws from the Union, and with them, 6 states secede. They elect a new president, Jefferson Davis, and they form the Confederate States of America. The bombardment of Fort Sumter happens on April 12th, 1861, and they secede because they say the country is ruled by a sectional party, that there is a violation of states' rights, and that really one of the most important reasons for them, obviously, is to ensure that slavery is protected. While Jefferson Davis does not address slavery as a reason, his vice president, Alexander Stephens, says in his cornerstone speech that the foundation of the Confederacy lays in the triumph of the white race over the black race. What are those differences between the North and South? Here I've listed kind of economic, demographic, and cultural differences between the two, put them side by side to really help you get a good image of what is happening between the two so that you can see why there is so much fighting between the two. This is all due to regional economic changes, demographic changes, and cultural changes. The North is industrialized. They have a large population that continues to grow with lots of immigration, with the Irish, with the Germans. There's a rise of nativism, but there is also population growth in the North that continues even with nativist ideas. The culture in the North is very different than the South. And although the abolitionists are a small minority, they are growing in the 40s and the 50s. The South, on the other hand, is based on a plantation economy. It's based on slave labor. Even though only 25% of people own slaves, it is still a key way of life in the South. They have very slow and low population growth and almost no immigration coming in at all, which means they are not diverse. Culturally, the South increasingly begins to defend slavery as a Southern way of life. Fitzhugh and John C. Calhoun are the developers of that pro slavery argument that slaves are, quote, part of the family, that they are treated better than the wage slaves of the North, and that they are working to civilize inferior, quote unquote, people. We also see an increase in racial stereotyping at this time through things like minstrel shows, where whites are painting themselves in blackface and acting in very stereotypical and racist ways. We also see at this time a gag resolution where there ends up being a ban on any discussion of any anti slavery petition being discussed in Congress. And so this is obviously a problem. It will finally be overturned in 1844 by John Quincy Adams. Why is there distrust? There is mutual distrust between both the North and the South. And here I list different reasons why there is a mistrust between the two. These are things that we have already discussed, but I wanted to lay that out side by side so that you have a good view and vision of why the North does not trust the South and why the South does not trust the North. It's not one issue, it is multiple issues that lead to this problem. So when we look at the South versus the North, this Union victory, spoiler, the North is going to win. This Union victory, the Civil War, and the contested Reconstruction of the South do settle the issues of slavery and secession, but it's going to leave many unresolved questions about the power of the federal government and the rights of citizens. And it is going to be, we're going to discuss in this portion the Civil War and Reconstruction specifically. So the South is fighting what they consider to be a defensive war. And they believe all they have to do is just not lose it. They just have to protect their territory and they're fine. They're also fighting amongst a very friendly population because the majority of the battles are going to happen in the South. They have a sense of purpose as they're fighting for what they see as their Southern way of life. And they are also seeing themselves as fighting to defend slavery and states' rights because they feel like the federal government is abusing them. They also have many veteran military officials like Robert E. Lee, who are going to join the Confederacy when the war begins. The North, though, very slowly will begin to show their advantages. So they have a lot more industrial resources. They have a higher population, which means they have more soldiers that can fight. They do end up with some wonderful military leaders later in the war, like William Tecumseh Sherman and Ulysses S. Grant. And they have a robust Navy, which is going to help them with their Anaconda Plan. So what are some of those key moments in the war? Now, this is not something they're not going to ask you in the AP exam to list numerous military battles. It's just not something that they focus on. So don't spend a ton of time memorizing 80 different battles. I've given you what I consider to be probably the most important of all the battles, all summed up on a single slide. So the North uses their Navy to implement the thing that I just discussed. That's the Anaconda Plan. If you remember, this is a 3-part plan to blockade the coast, to then divide the Mississippi River, and then to attack the capital at Richmond. And they believe if they do those 3 things, the war will end. Early on, the South has success and they win the Battle of Bull Run. Why is that important? Because it proves to both sides that the war is not going to be over in 90 days, which they think is going to happen. Stonewall Jackson brings reinforcements and secures that win for the South. And so that is very, very important. We also have the Peninsula Campaign, which is yet another defeat for the South. I'm sorry, for the North. They're going to come in, they're going to try an amphibious landing and push up the coast, trying to attack Richmond. It is not going to work. And so these two things together prove that, wow, this is going to be a long, drawn out battle. The North is, though, going to eventually find numerous successes. The North begins to see some victories in battle. So when we look at the Battle of Antietam, this is, even though it's a military draw, it prevents foreign intervention on the side of the Confederacy from both England and France, because the South does not win the battle. And so because of that, both England and France decide they are going to stay out. They're not going to get involved, and they're going to allow this to be a struggle between just two parts of North America. This also lends Abraham Lincoln to announce his Emancipation Proclamation. After Antietam, the war changes, and it does change to one that adds slavery in addition to secession as one of the battle cries. Then we see Gettysburg, which stops the Confederates to attack on Union soil in Pennsylvania. Lincoln is going to return to that site, and he's going to issue his Gettysburg Address, which is a very short but purposeful message about how to build a stronger, greater nation of the people, by the people, and for the people. And it's going to be the first time that someone refers to it as the United States of America instead of these United States. And it's the idea that we are a united nation. We'll see the Battle of Vicksburg, where Ulysses S. Grant gains control of the Mississippi River, one of those main parts of the Anaconda Plan. We will see Sherman's march to the sea, where he attacks Atlanta, goes throughout Georgia, and launches what is called total war. It's one of deliberate destruction throughout the South, and it is part of the Union strategy, where they destroy the Southern environment and all of its infrastructure. When we look at mobilization, how did that work? How did people come together to fight? Both the North and the South need to mobilize their economies for the war, and they need to mobilize their societies to get ready. Both are going to adopt conscription laws where men are needed for the fighting. In both the North and the South, these conscription laws are extraordinarily unfair to the poor people. So in the North, for $300, you could hire a substitute to do the fighting for you. In the South, if you have more than 20 slaves, they called it the 20 Negro Law, you were exempt from having to fight. As a result of this, we see many people say that this is a rich man's war, but a poor man's fight. And this is why we're going to see fighting. One of the most famous is the New York City draft riots that will happen in July of 1960, where mostly Irish Americans attacked the wealthy and also African Americans. There's also a series of laws up north that are passed in order to raise money and to gain support for the war. And we have three extraordinarily important acts or things that happened during the Civil War itself, some of which I've already discussed, but I want to reiterate. So we have the Morrill Tariff, which increases the import tariff in the United States, and this is done in 1861 to provide more funds. We see the National Bank Act, which provides a national currency, which is secured by a pledge of the United States bonds, and it's to provide for the circulation and redemption of money. And after this, we're going to call it the National Bank Act. And we see the Homestead Act, where 160 acres of land is given to you if you can work it and improve it for 5 years. All right, so let's take a look, though, at some of the opposition that's happening. When we go to war, we know that people are not going to be happy, and there's some things that happen that are seen as not necessarily constitutional, such as the suspension of writ of habeas corpus. So in the South, both Jefferson Davis is going to face opposition, and in the North, Abraham Lincoln is going to face opposition on the home front. Jefferson Davis has a very difficult time. He has a lack of resources throughout the Confederacy. He also has to deal with the states' rights issue. So that hinders his ability to get soldiers to fight because they won't leave their own states to fight. When he calls up for troops, they're like, I'll fight in Georgia, but I'm not going anywhere else. And then he has to pay for the war by levying a war tax, but many of the southern states that seceded just refused to pay for it. And so he had no ability to really fund the fighting. Lincoln had a number of challenges himself. So one of the things is he suspends the writ of habeas corpus in Maryland. This is a border state. He does other things like issuing executive orders that stop newspapers from printing critical things about the Union. And he does this to keep the border states in the Union. Lincoln does have to run for re-election in 1864. So here he has to fight a political battle in the middle of an actual battle. And he has to deal with the radical Republicans, the war Democrats, the peace Democrats, and the Copperheads, who are all pushing him to do different things as they think it should be done. Now, Lincoln does issue this Emancipation Proclamation. He decides to move forward with announcing it after the Battle of Antietam. And this does change the purpose of war from one of just secession to adding, obviously, slavery as an issue. This really strengthens the Northern cause because it's no longer about just secession, but it's also about slavery. It also helps keep Europe from giving any sort of diplomatic support to the Confederacy. It gives the Union new African American soldiers to continue to fight in the Union Army. And for instance, Frederick Douglass sees this as an opportunity for Black people to prove their citizenship. This is in direct opposition to the Dred Scott decision. And there are some limits to this proclamation. For instance, the North has no authority over the Confederacy. So they cannot, even though they say they're going to free the slaves of the South, they can't free them until the slaves of the South are taken over by the North. Also, it does not apply to border states. So when people say that the Emancipation Proclamation freed the slaves, please remember it did not free all the slaves. Slaves are not actually free in this country until the 13th Amendment. Once the 13th Amendment is passed, that's when slaves are free throughout the entire United States. All right, let's move on to Reconstruction now. So there is huge differences between the different plans. We have the Lincoln plan, we have the Johnson plan, and then we have the Radical Reconstruction plan. Lincoln's plan is obviously not going to happen because he's assassinated before the war even ends. He did come up with this plan before the war ended, though, but it's called the 10% plan. It is very soft on the South, and it's done so on purpose because Lincoln really wanted the country to come back together as quickly as possible. So Lincoln's Reconstruction plan said that if 10% of Southern people in the South voted to return, they would just have to have a loyalty pledge of just 10% of people in any one of those Southern states. And they had to ratify the 13th Amendment. And if they did those two things, they were able to come back in. Unfortunately, Lincoln, though, is assassinated by John Wilkes Booth shortly after Lee's surrender in 1865, and his plan obviously is not going to happen. Then Johnson becomes president. Now, Johnson is a staunch Southerner, and he thinks that the South should rebuild their own institutions. He does not believe that slaves have the ability to care for themselves at all. And he stood by while slave owning classes were trying to enact Black codes. And so because of that, we are going to see the radical Republicans take over Reconstruction. He is going to begin to veto their congressional acts. They are going to override every one of his vetoes. And this is going to open the door for this permanent divide between Johnson and Congress. So both radical and moderate Republicans take over Reconstruction policy from the president. When he vetoes an extension of the Freedmen's Bureau and the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which was going to give equal protection under the law to African Americans. So as a result, there is a change in the balance of power between Congress and the presidency. The Congress overrides every one of the president's vetoes, and they pass both of the laws that the president vetoed. They do not care. They're going to make sure it happens. They then push to get the 14th Amendment passed to ensure that these rights could not be taken away from African Americans and that they would be seen as citizens. As a result, they're going to begin their own phase of Reconstruction and pass things like the Freedmen's Bureau that will give support for poor whites and Blacks in the South and provide things like food, clothing, housing, medical care, legal help, and set up schools. Congressional Reconstruction is best symbolized as the Reconstruction Act of 1867. This act divides the South into 5 military districts, and on the map that you can see there, I have these 5 districts laid out for you, so you can kind of get an idea of the space and place that I'm talking about. Each one of these districts would be controlled by a Union general, and this is radical Reconstruction. Congress then determines the readmission requirements. The Johnson and Lincoln plans are both invalidated, and new requirements are set up that you have to have a new state constitution, you have to include Black suffrage in that plan, and you must ratify both the 13th and 14th Amendments to enter the Union. This leads to a period of time where we have the very first president who will be impeached. Remember, impeachment does not mean removal. Impeachment means charges brought against, okay? And we've had 3 presidents who've been impeached. So the Tenure of Office Act is passed, and it says that the Senate must approve any presidential dismissal of any cabinet position. Or general. Well, President Johnson does not like his Secretary of War, Edward Stanton. He's a leftover from Lincoln, and he's a radical Republican, and he is basically giving away the secrets to Congress of what he's talking about. So it's always been the policy that the president can pick their own cabinet. Obviously, they have to have approval of the Senate, but there's never been a discussion that they can't fire or ask for the resignation of a member of their cabinet. So he does so. As soon as he does so, the House of Representatives issues an order of impeachment against him. He is put on trial, but he is not convicted. He is just 1 vote short of the 2/3 required. Why? Because there are moderate Republicans who do not vote to impeach because they are concerned that this will mess with the checks and balances that are established in the Constitution. So they put the duty of the nation ahead of their own partisan feelings. So good on them for doing so. So this radical reconstruction does have successes. The Union is slowly reunited under this new framework, as well as there is some rearrangement in the relationship between white and Black people in the South. We can see that Hiram Revels is elected senator in Mississippi in 1870. To the seat that ironically Jefferson Davis used to hold. Also, other African American congressmen are voted into office during this radical reconstruction phase. So we do see these successes that start coming through. But Reconstruction is an unfinished promise to African Americans. The civil rights acts that we look at that are extraordinarily important, the big amendments that come through that we see as what we call the Reconstruction Amendments, are the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Although they granted rights, many of these rights are restricted in different ways. Segregation and Jim Crow laws are going to go into effect in the 1870s and 80s, and they will continue through to the 1960s. Local political tactics like literacy tests, poll taxes, and the grandfather clauses will be used to disenfranchise African American voters. Violence is going to be used to scare and suppress African Americans in the South. The Supreme Court is going to issue decisions that begin to overturn Reconstruction laws. We have Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896 that states segregation is constitutional as long as it's equal. So it starts the separate but equal doctrine that will not be overturned until Brown versus the Board of Education. We have the civil rights cases in 1883 that says discrimination is allowed if it's done by individuals or private businesses, and that the Civil Rights Acts of 1875 are actually unconstitutional. It's important to know that the Reconstruction Amendments did establish judicial principles that would eventually become the basis for court decisions to uphold laws. The 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause is going to serve as the basis for Brown versus the Board of Education in the 1954 decision that will overturn racial segregation, and especially, obviously, that Plessy v. Ferguson case. This is going to be used in the 1950s and 60s by the civil rights movement to provide a broadened basis of rights. There will be division among the women's rights movements, by the way, during all of this time period. So for instance, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton are going to be opposed to Black male suffrage in the 15th Amendment because they become clear that it's only for men. And so because of that, they are going to form the National Women's Suffrage Association. They're extraordinarily upset. And they argue that the 15th Amendment should not just be men, it should be men and women. Others like Lucy Stone and Henry Blackwell are going to argue that it's important that they will work instead on women's suffrage at the state level, and that they are going to support Reconstruction, and they are going to form the American Women's Suffrage Association. So we are going to see a division between the women's rights movements because of the events of Reconstruction. When we look at life for African Americans, yes, the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery, but that does not mean that life for African Americans is going to be easy. After Reconstruction, Black codes are put in place. Their purpose is to guarantee a stable labor supply now that African Americans are emancipated. So Southerners are going to try to hope to restore many of their pre-emancipation systems of race relations. So, for instance, Black codes make it illegal for African Americans to rent um, land or to borrow money in order to buy land. They're going to be forced to sign labor contracts. And if you didn't have a labor contract, you could be arrested for vagrancy. They are going to create very stringent penalties for leaving your contract before your contract's expired. African Americans are not allowed to vote. They are not allowed to serve in a jury. They are not allowed to testify in court. So all of these things are going to take away their rights. As a result of these things, many African Americans are forced into a system that we call sharecropping. Understand that there are some poor whites that are forced into the same system where they are allowed to use the land in exchange for giving a percentage of the crops to the owner of that land. But what that means is they're basically like peasants on the land. They're bound to it. They're forced to work it, and the amount of crops that they have to give make it so that they can never get out of debt, and they constantly live in this segregated society that is abusive to them. In the end, segregation is going to end. Reconstruction is going to fall apart for quite a few reasons. One is determined Southern resistance. The Ku Klux Klan is established to secure white supremacy and to resist Reconstruction government. The Redeemer governments are going to come about, and they're going to seek to remove Republican governments that are made up of coalitions of things like freedmen, carpetbaggers, and scallywags. The Redeemers are also trying to get all of these groups out of the South, and in do so, they often use violence, intimidation, and graft, and sometimes even murder to try to gain political power and to remove these groups from government. There's also the thought that the North no longer really wanted to work as hard. They were no longer as interested as using the power of the government to maintain Reconstruction. We see the Amnesty Act of 1872 that returns voting rights to almost all Confederates. We see the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which does guarantee equal access to public places. It's kind of the last big law as a push for civil rights, but it is going to be overturned by the Supreme Court in 1883. In the 1870s, both Congress and the president, who is President Grant at this time, show that they're unwilling to use the federal government as a source of power to monitor Southern society. The Panic of 1873 happens, and the nation becomes more concerned in the North about economic issues. And we see the election of 1876, which is a disputed election and is not solved until we see the Compromise of 1877. Tilden wins a majority of popular votes, but neither Tilden nor Hayes wins enough electoral votes. Both South Carolina, Louisiana, and Florida both claim victory, and they send electors of both parties, both Democrat and Republican. So a special election electoral commission has to be formed. It has a majority of Republicans on it. So obviously they fine for Hayes because he is the Republican. The Democrats threaten to block this inauguration, and they come up with a deal, with a bargain. And they say Hayes would be allowed the presidency as long as he withdraws troops from the South. He agrees to do so, and this is the final draw. This is the end of Reconstruction in the South. All right, for this time period, can you discuss all of these ideas and thoughts on these next two slides? Make sure you can go through them, make sure you know what they are. And in the end, make sure you can answer these questions. What are the motives and consequences of Western expansion? What are the causes and consequences of the Civil War? And how does the US government react to post-Civil War pressures from both Northerners and Southerners? All right, guys, that is the end of period 5, unit 5. Keep studying, keep studying.